Investment is large.
Best thing I can do is just mention a few.
Perhaps there'll be a wake-up.
Hear more about our...
We highlight the three key challenges of the economy and place infrastructure and the need for infrastructure.
I've been asked to comment primarily on private sector involvement in transport provision. But before I say anything much about that, I think I need to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room. It's been a really bad couple of weeks for private providers of public use infrastructure in Scotland. The Edinburgh Schools fiasco has highlighted, I think, three general issues. The blame culture. Public projects are still political footballs, short on facts often, short on analysis, very long on hindsight, very long on recrimination. I sense a continuing unease that the private sector should be doing that kind of thing. I think that's often, I question, isn't that perhaps just an unease about whether the private sector is a good thing in itself? And fundamentally, how best can we encourage and ensure quality in a project, whether it's a public sector project or a private sector project? If I may, I'll look at those issues briefly before equally briefly touching on what the private sector might do in the foreseeable future in transport. The blame culture. None of us likes making mistakes. It's embarrassing, and we all really know in our hearts of hearts that we should admit them and learn from them. But a blame culture doesn't really help with that. And I think that blame culture is actually worse in the public sector, which still finds it difficult not to blame a decision, even if it was taken, a difficult decision, taken in an appropriate manner based upon sound data that just turns out in hindsight to have been wrong. Sometimes we just get it wrong. I'm not saying Edinburgh's that, by the way. And until we do that, until we realise that sometimes we just get it wrong and that's the way that we go forward, people will cover up mistakes and we won't learn from them. And that's compounded if there are political points to be scored. We need to accept that things go wrong despite people, sometimes despite people's best efforts. And if we did that, we'd start learning from our mistakes. Should the private sector be doing this stuff? I've spent most of my working life at the interface between the public and the private sectors. There's nothing, in my view, intrinsically good or bad about either. Both have their shortcomings, both have their rogues and incompetence, and both have fine examples of dedication and skill. Surely a decision on which sector should provide a service, leaving aside how that service is actually paid for eventually, should generally be based on what works best. Sometimes public, sometimes private, and often a mix of both. The NHS is probably the most treasured part of our public sector. Internationally, the most admired part of the NHS is primary care. GPs to you and me. And yet, almost all of our GPs are in fact private contractors working for health boards. Are their motivations and is their competence automatically suspect as a consequence? No. Why not? Because we think they're doing a good thing. Why shouldn't that sort of thought go into the provision of infrastructure or any other service? We still hear objections about profit being made from the sick, and yet all hospitals in the UK are designed and built by the private sector, by private sector architects, private sector builders, whether they're procured directly by the NHS or not. And all those builders and all those architects expect to make a profit. Whether it's PPP or PFI or direct procurement, it really doesn't make a difference. And all PPP capital projects, and the Minister will be well aware of this and his team ensure it, PPP NPD projects don't get a go-ahead unless they at least match or beat direct procurement. And the fantasy that there are legions of biased or corrupt civil servants who just sign stuff off is exactly that. It's just a fantasy. It's a rigorous process. And then there are those who say, what's all this risk transfer stuff? there's no real risk in construction, it's just building. How difficult could that be? Well, I think Edinburgh shows us it can be quite difficult, and I think Edinburgh shows us there are risks and people sometimes get it wrong. So are private providers entitled to make a profit? Yes. Should private sector procurers try to cap that profit to reasonable levels? Of course. What are the windfall profits made by PPP projects? Well, in reality, most of those so-called windfalls were actually made as a result of refinancings. And the whole refinancing issue was relatively quickly put to bed as soon as the then Partnerships UK actually put a reasonable offer on the table, and refinancings from that point forward were encouraged and the shares for them were split. It's now a little bit academic, but that was really where so-called windfalls came from, and that problem went away quite a long time ago. Quality and cost. Cost's an easy thing to measure, relatively. Overall value for money is actually really difficult, balancing cost and quality. In the UK in general, in my view, and in Scotland in particular, the public sector's got much better at moving away from simply judging price and is much better instead at targeting overall value for money. I think if we were building our own house or building an extension, we'd be a little suspicious of a really cheap bid, and we'd ask, is the quality there? Am I actually getting what I'm paying for? Or is that exactly the problem? I'll get what I pay for and I'm not paying enough. European procurement regulations have required more transparent scoring of bids, and that takes account of both cost and quality. In my view, at least in some projects, we could do more to increase the amount of points that go towards quality, but that's perhaps for another day. But leaving that aside, how fundamentally do we ensure that a building or a project is built to an agreed design and built to agreed quality? Are there lessons here from Edinburgh schools? Probably. Perhaps there'll be a wake-up call. But we need to let the literal and the metaphorical dust settle a bit before we talk too much about it. I'm very conscious I'm sitting in a lawyer's office before I say much more, and I need to be very careful. But it would be surprising if, when that dust does settle, we didn't find that there were real sins of at least omission, and perhaps commission as well. Basic questions need to be asked and answered. Was the design at fault? Was it perhaps insufficiently detailed? I don't know. More likely, were the buildings not built to specification? Crucially, how was the construction supervised and signed off? And with the best of intentions, did the council itself perhaps overreact when it closed some of the schools? And was this a consequence of PFI? I doubt it. Rather, I suspect it's an object lesson in how to supervise or not supervise a project. And if we want better supervision, and if we want better quality, then we need to be prepared to pay for it. I'm actually quite proud that my company has never won a project on price. We've always won it on quality. More than half of our projects have been nominated for or have won design awards, including New Stob Hill Hospital, which Michael was kind enough to mention, which we're exceptionally proud of. It's really unusual for a hospital to be voted best public building. How do we procure them? We're quite old-fashioned. We've always had an employer's agent, to use the old-fashioned term. And I believe that all clients, not just in PPPs, but in sale and leasebacks, general developments and buildings generally, we all need to be vigilant and alert to potential conflicts of interest. And rather than underpaying separate professional advisors to monitor projects, I would argue often inadequately for separate interested parties, be they users, owners, funders, or whoever, I still believe we'd be better off paying one properly qualified firm a realistic fee to do the job more thoroughly on behalf of all of them with a broad scope of skills. And that way, I think projects will be properly supervised, because clearly some projects haven't been. So a word about transport.
Briefly, if you can.
Very briefly. Let's acknowledge that actually, despite its shortcomings, we're pretty lucky in Scotland. It's not often that government departments and the way they're organised hit the headlines, but actually the way that Transport Scotland is organised is, I think, a role model for the way in which transport should be provided in the rest of the UK. Because of the way it's organised, I think it's easier to map out and manage transport infrastructure. And just as the old Scottish executive was always much better at managing their PPP programme than its English counterparts, we actually do transport better in Scotland. Looking at each of the sectors, roads, Transport Scotland is committed to a major building programme, all of which will be built by the public sector, who will probably then maintain most of them, regardless of how they're procured and paid for. Should this new build programme be procured at least in part through some form of PPP? Possibly. Rail. In Scotland, privatisation, whatever its faults, I think didn't fragment provision in the baffling way which it did south of the border. So generally it seems to have worked better here. We've certainly seen an improvement in the way it's provided. There's a very ambitious rail improvement programme underway. Similarly, like roads, the track will be laid and maintained by the private sector generally. Should this be procured at least in part through some form of PPP, with the exception of station redevelopments? Probably not. Air, we've always had a mixed economy of airport provision in Scotland. We'll have for years now. Big airports generally in the private sector, small airports generally in the public sector, still owned by Scottish ministers through Hans and Arns airports. And there are interesting models there, but again, it's a mixed economy, and it's a mixed economy that works well. Ferries, another example of a mixed economy, taking the best of the public and private sector with some baffling contractual stuff as well with ferries, but leaving that to one side, I think you're seeing there a willingness to look at what works and go with what works best. And because I served on the Scottish Advisory Board of British Waterways, as it was then, I have to say a little bit about canals, which of course are the jewel in the crown of the Scottish infrastructure network. It's an interesting little outfit, Scottish Canals. It does co-development, it does regeneration, it does partnership working, it contracts for projects large and small, they retain a direct workforce, and yet they also manage very large capital projects, from the renovation of Telford's masterpiece, the Caledonian Canal, through to iconic structures like the Falkirk Wheel. It's a really interesting example of the best of the private sector working with the best of the public sector. And you've probably heard quite enough from me.
Thank you very much.
Investment is largely.
Best thing you can do is just mention a few.
Perhaps there'll be a wake-up.
To hear more about our.
We highlight the three key challenges of the economy and place infrastructure and the need for infrastructure.